That is what is happening, of course, in countries like Rwanda, where in the last literally 7 years, some 10,000 churches have been shut down in Rwanda. Their population is 20% of South Africa's. So just extrapolate those numbers and you can see the potential consequences for South Africa. I say that because the CRL chair has specifically said that that's one country that she's looking at as possibly a model. China's another. If there are 5,000 pastors in jail in China at the moment, I think, yes, we have rights. Those rights have limitations, and I think they also have responsibilities. It's not just a free-for-all, and it never has been, and it never should be. My personal viewpoint is that if you are in that trust position as a religious leader, and you abuse that position, and you resort to criminality, whatever that might look like, then it's not that there's a different crime. That doesn't make it a spiritual crime. But I think what you can do, and sometimes it does happen in the sentencing aspect of a trial, assuming that you're found guilty after due process, is maybe you should get like the full weight of the law should fall upon you. Importantly, stand up for your rights. Those rights were hard won. That we didn't just wake up one day and thought, oh, let's give everybody a right to religious freedom. It was really the consequence of horrific persecution. In some countries in the religious wars in Europe, 60% of the entire population of entire countries died. You know, we're talking about a level of bloodshed that has actually been the purchasing power, so to speak, of these very rights. And these rights are recent. One of the challenges then, as you correctly point out, is that if you on a Sunday said to your congregation, reading out of the Bible, in the beginning God made them male and female, God did not create a third sex, and God is not confused about the sex of the body that you find yourself in, because you are perfectly and wonderfully made. Those statements would be, I think, both theologically true, and I think they would be biologically true. The fact is they might be deeply offensive to people who believe that I am in the wrong body, or I don't believe that there are only male and female. I believe that gender is a spectrum. Now, the question is, should those people be empowered by a law to then file criminal charges against you simply for what you stated, which is theologically true and biologically true?
Michael Swain, welcome back to the In HeinzSight BoldCast. Thanks for being with me today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Heinz, for having me.
What a privilege. I'm honored to say you are a returning guest on this program. And for anyone who's listening that missed the previous one, please go check it out on our channel. But we are picking up where we left off, talking about a few important matters. And I think first up is the CRL committee, this push to regulate religion in South Africa with a seeming undercurrent of actually coming for the Christian church and specifically the charismatic evangelical side of it. So let's start with, Michael, what is the latest? How are things going? And then we can talk about, listen, what should the church be aware of and how can we help and support?
Well, I think maybe, Heinz, just to start at the very beginning, because I think when people hear about religious freedom, they don't necessarily understand fully what it means and why it's so important.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's not just do we have the right to read our Bibles or to pray in our homes or even go to church on Sundays. Religious freedom as a constitutional right is what is called an a priori right, or some would call it an inalienable right. In other words, it's not a right that the state gives you. The state might be able to give you a right to, say, housing or clean water or something, but these are not rights that religious freedom is not a right that the state gives. It simply guarantees it. It recognizes it. It is your right simply because you are a human being. You are made in the image of God. And obviously it's an absolutely integral part of your human dignity, because we don't just check our faith and beliefs in, at the front door when we leave for work in the morning. They are part of who we are. And therefore, the role of the state is to uphold and protect them. And yes, there's a framework within which we exercise them. We obviously have to exercise them lawfully and reasonably, shall we say. But that is not something that the state can actually take away from us, because it is what? It is conscience, thought, belief, opinion, your right to assemble, to associate, That's why we have faith-based schools. You're right as a parent to pass on your faith and your belief to your children, especially when they're little.
Yeah.
So when we start talking about state regulation of religion, what we're talking about is a fundamental reset of that social contract, so to speak, that relationship between the church, let's say faith communities writ large, and the state, where they're now saying, we will evaluate your faith to see if it is in some measure acceptable. And if it is, then we will grant you a license, a conditional license, whereby you can practice according to the parameters that we set. Yeah. And if you break those parameters, we will remove your license.
There will be consequences. Yeah.
So that is what is happening, of course, in countries like Rwanda, where in the last literally 7 years, some 10,000 churches have been shut down in Rwanda.
My goodness.
Now, their population is 20% of South Africa's.
Yeah.
So just extrapolate those numbers and you can see the potential consequences for South Africa.
It's massive.
Now, I say that because the CRL chair has specifically said that that's one country that she's looking at as possibly a model. China's another. If there are 5,000 pastors in jail in China at the moment. So, again, state regulation effectively is the death of any meaningful right to religious freedom. And that's why this battle, let's call it a battle, because it really is a fight, is so important and why we cannot afford to lose it.
And your organization is literally called Freedom of Religion.
Yes.
So this is right up your alley. This is why you're in the fight, in the thick of it, and it's so important. Your comments now made me think of something that I think is actually quite important to maybe just pause on for a moment. What is your understanding of freedom? When we say freedom of, what is that freedom? It's something that I'm personally just sort of journeying with as well, because I'm talking about our movement 180 with which we want to try and change the nation's direction. And one of the values we are looking at is freedom. And what is the definition of that? And I think that's a conversation. I think that's different things to different people, but there should be a core definition that everyone should understand and should rally around. Like that's freedom. So, but I'd love to know, how do you, as a lawyer, as a legal mind, as someone who's fought for this, how do you understand freedom?
Well, I think specifically freedom of religion. Yeah. And this, interestingly and significantly, was very much a process that took place in the sort of 2008-2010 period, where an organization of lawyers and academics and multiple faith inputs from across the faith sector came together and produced what is known as the Religious Freedom Charter.
Okay.
And what that did in some detail is it basically expounded on the right to religious freedom. What does this right actually mean?
All right.
And that's very important because, again, it's if you say conscience, thought, belief, opinion, and faith, that's almost like a suitcase. You've got to unpack it a bit to figure out what's actually there.
Yeah, because words have meaning, and people assume sometimes meaning, or they add meaning that might not be there, or it's so open-ended, it's dangerous. So definitions are important, right?
So freedom always has limitations. I think that's important.
Very important.
I mean, my right to freedom of movement ends 1 inch from your nose.
Makes sense.
So, and of course, rights also should have, in order to be exercised correctly, responsibilities.
Yes.
And that was one of the
limitations and responsibilities.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that when this whole matter of state regulation of religion was debated last time, because don't forget, we've been down this road before in detail, and it was debated for 6 days in Parliament, and everybody had their say, and Parliament at that point rejected the CRL's proposals for some form of legislative framework of peer review committees and what have you. They didn't accept that at all. But what they did say was they said that there should be a code of conduct developed. And that happened. So, one of the things that the CRL chair has said is things have got so much worse since the last time. Well, no, they haven't. Because, among other things, what happened was that the same organization that developed the Religious Freedom Charter, which is, as I said to you, an expounding of the rights of religious freedom, were then invited to conduct a similar interactive collegiate process amongst faith communities and to produce a code of conduct, which is, of course, the, let's say, corresponding other side of the coin responsibilities of religious freedom. So what can you reasonably expect a religious organization or a religious practitioner to do, to be, to behave, how should they function and operate. That's the code of conduct. And so that was developed. Now, obviously, these things are voluntary. People have to, say, yes, I'll embrace them. And we thoroughly encourage and endorse churches, religious organizations actually incorporating those into their founding documentation, their constitutions, because they give really good protections, among other things. And I think, yes, a very reasonable baseline for what you should and could expect when you come into a religious organization or into what they call a sacred space. So I think if that maybe answers your questions, I think, yes, we have rights. Those rights have limitations, and I think they also have responsibilities. So it's not just a free-for-all, and it never has been and it never should be.
Yeah. Freedom is not license. It's liberty. And,
exactly.
And there's a difference. I think that's important to understand. And because some people, use the word freedom as an excuse to harm and to do damage. And I think, but it also gets interesting when people who, let's say, has a deep dislike for Christians or people of another faith, when they say that, when they use their freedom to attack your freedom, then it gets very interesting because I've been attacked on some levels for standing up for what I believe in. And, you get people who say, well, you can't say that. And I'm like, actually, I may, because this is what I believe. And then, but it offends me. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry that it offends you in a way, but it doesn't make it any less true. But then they want to use their freedom to swear at, attack, defame. And then it gets very interesting, that whole thing. So it's a constant figuring out of where are the limitations. And, social media has got rules, community guidelines. Sometimes you are just doing what you're doing and they say you're, crossing the line. But then someone who swore at you and belittled you and defamed you, they're okay. So it's very interesting, the space we're in today.
So I think that there are two elements there. The one is, of course, that you often do get rights that are in competition with one another in some measure.
Okay.
So you have a right, I have a right, and now somehow these rights are coming into conflict. And in our constitutional democracy, the way that is typically resolved, if it gets to that level of, say, litigation, is you have to find a solution. The one solution is, of course, reasonably accommodating one another. Can you reasonably accommodate a right, even if you don't particularly want it? One example of that was there was a case in Natal, in fact, in KZN, of a young Hindu student who had gone through a coming-of-age ceremony. And as a consequence, and one of the symbols of that was a small stud that she had in her nose. And the school that she went to had a no jewelry policy. And they said, look, this is our school, this is education, we have a policy, we have a right to make it, that's our right. And she said, well, look, I have a right, religious freedom, this is freedom of expression, this is my legitimate way of, demonstrating my faith.
Yeah, it's a tricky one.
And it's a tricky one. And the reasonable accommodation for religious freedom was made so that, yes, she could, because that was seen to be something which did not subvert the entire no jewelry policy, but it did allow her to express her religious freedom. And I think that was a good decision.
Okay.
So reasonable accommodation is one way that we can get around this.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing about religious freedom writ large is, of course, it operates within the rule of law.
Yeah.
So this is not the Wild West. I mean, I think sometimes the CRL paints the faith communities out as they're just sort of living their wildest, craziness.
Doing what they want.
No, obviously not. I mean, I think obviously the vast majority of pastors and priests and imams and rabbis, they're law-abiding people, and they're doing so because they have a genuine calling, and their desire is to serve their communities, and they're doing that to the best of their ability.
Yeah.
Yes, there are always going to be bad actors. There are bad actors in every, unfortunately, faith and what have you, or profession. But that's not what they intend and set out to do. They don't wake up in the morning thinking, how lawless can I be today?
Yeah.
And obviously we're bound by lots of laws. I mean, think of your church building, for example, or the building regulations that you have to have. Think of, if you employ people, the registrations that you have to do, SARS, your commitment to paying your taxes, your compliance as an NPO or an NGO. You have to obviously do your auditing accounts, and there are certain other things that you need to do.
Yeah, just to operate normally, there's already a bunch of regulations that you've had to follow.
It is not that the faith communities are unregulated.
Exactly.
They are very highly regulated. But this, i.e. this whole push to license somehow and to restrict and to limit your expression of your faith, that's where the problem lies.
Yeah. What are the main things that they want to implement that is concerning to you and that should be concerning to anyone leading a church or going to a church in the Christian community?
Well, they dress it up this time particularly very much in sort of, Christian terms, and you'll even see sort of scriptures quoted in some of the documentation that they've produced.
Oh, wow.
But here's the problem. First of all, this Section 22 committee is targeting the Christian faith.
Specifically, yeah.
That is already discriminatory. It's discriminatory on both sides. It's discriminatory because it's targeting Christians, and the CRL chair's response is, well, we're coming for the Muslims next, But that doesn't solve the problem.
That's
the other thing that it does, of course, and which is why the Islamic faith communities have actually filed litigation against the Section 22 and the CRL, is they're saying, look, you're proposing, and this is also a very important element, no matter how they try and dress it up, it's proposing a legislative framework. Whenever you hear legislation or legislative or similar, you have to understand that is Parliament, that is the state. And so a legislative framework for self-regulation is a contradiction in terms.
It's an oxymoron.
It's exactly. It is obviously the state intervention,
regulating
state control of religion.
Yeah.
Put an equal sign and say state control of religion.
Wow.
So that is in and of itself deeply problematic. But of course, the Islamic faith communities are, and others for that matter, are basically saying that is doubly discriminatory because we have in our constitution laws of general application. You cannot pass a law that discriminates against, say, the Christian faith, but leaves the Jewish faith or the Islamic faith or any other faith in a different position. It's a one-size-fits-all. So just as the constitutional right to religious freedom protects all faiths and all beliefs, anything that restricts that will apply equally to all faiths and all beliefs. And so what they're saying legitimately is, well, you're going to consult the Christian faith and then you're going to propose regulations and maybe legislation to govern them. That will affect us. We won't even have had the opportunity to have an input into this. And if you give us a subsequent opportunity, that's not at all acceptable because you've already decided the course of action.
Yes, and what might be applicable to the Christian community will either not be applicable or even more detrimental to another faith community potentially.
Precisely, and they haven't had a
relevant.
Chance.
Yeah.
And so the CRL's response to that is, well, we're going to set up one of these Section 22 committees for every single faith. Well, that means at least 8 more of these processes.
And more money from the taxpayer.
Lot more money from the taxpayer.
Someone has to pay for all of it.
And then somehow you have to take all these inputs from all these national consultations for all these different faith groupings and somehow sort of smorgasbord them all into one size-fits-all package. How can you do that? It is so unworkable. It is so ill-conceived. And yet they seem to be full speed ahead with this agenda, which is extraordinary.
I have a theory. I think, obviously, you and I know that life is spiritual and there are spiritual things at work. But we don't have to go into that too much. I think the other thing that I sense when someone has grabbed onto something and they are relentlessly pursuing that thing, there's a deeper reason. Like, I believe on some level there's personal hurt that's driving. Maybe this person that's driving this has had very bad experiences with the church in general or something, and she's out for almost like revenge. I may be wrong, but that's what it seems like because it's so targeted and so relentless. And I mean, she even went after you personally with legal action. What has that been like? And how are you okay? Is it like it's serious when someone on that level attacks you personally with legal action that's not founded, but they're obviously trying to threaten you.
Well, I think just to backtrack and talk to your original point, I don't ascribe motives to people. I just simply look at actions. And one of the things that is clear is that this push for state regulation of religion is actually an Africa-wide phenomenon. In other words, it isn't just isolated here in South Africa. It's happening at the moment in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Uganda, in Namibia, in Mozambique, in Botswana. It's happened in Rwanda. It's happened in Angola with disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, generally speaking, the strategy for its imposition or its implementation is the same. They look for some very high level, and they can find them, and there have been some horrors, let's be honest, incident in the faith community. And then that becomes the sort of poster child that almost brands all faith communities as potentially like that. And that's why we need these laws.
Wow.
And then the problem is that when you see what is restricted, it's interesting what's restricted. One of the things that is typically restricted by these regulations is any form of political speech. And I find that quite interesting because, of course, one of the, I think, important voices of the faith community is to be that speaking truth to power. It is to be, in a sense, the moral compass of the nation. And I think particularly the church in that sense. The prophetic voice of the church throughout all of human history has always been very important and consequential. Of course, if you can block that off, if you can control that, then that is quite a major constraint, I think, on the entire democratic process, never mind the spiritual dynamics that may be included.
Wow. Yeah.
So that, I think, is one of the bigger dangers of this as well, is as a consequence, you could see, and think of South Africa. I mean, we had very significant involvement from the Christian faith particularly, and other faiths, but think of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for example, and
big
Dr. Frank Chikane and others. So I think where there's a danger that might be a consequence, that is a serious issue. You spoke about the criminal charges that were laid against me by the CRL chair. That was an extraordinary thing. That happened quite early on. That happened, in fact, in June last year. And she called an urgent national press conference and spent literally 40 minutes defaming me and saying all sorts of completely untruthful things about me.
Goodness.
And then filed with an affidavit, in other words, a sworn statement from her, criminal charges against me for the crime of crimen injuria. She said that what I had said and was so egregious and so, let's say, wounding to her human personal dignity that, as she has said, that I should be put in jail for 5 years.
My goodness.
Now, number one, we are a legal advocacy organization for SA. We don't make statements unless we have very solid evidence to back what we say. We don't just suck it out of our thumbs.
Yeah.
And everything that I said was backed up by evidence that was taken from parliamentary records. Not something that we just made up.
Yeah.
We literally got the recordings from parliamentary records to justify the statements that we made.
Wow.
Now, she obviously didn't like the fact that I was referring particularly to a letter that was written at the end of her last term by 22 different religious organizations across the faith communities, over 12 million people represented, that basically said that she, or appealing to the president to say, please do not reappoint her for a second term. And there were 3 very good reasons. First of all, obviously, it was highly divisive. That last push for state regulation of religion was very divisive, very distracting, not at all what we believe is in the mandate of the CRL Rights Commission to do. They're supposed to bring unity and harmony, and they're supposed to educate and inform. The exact, of course, opposite was happening then. The next thing that we were obviously, and not we, but I mean these 22 religious organizations writing to the president, said that there was unfortunate instances where she had misled Parliament. So she had made statements to Parliament that were actually not true.
Yeah.
And she was actually sanctioned on 2 occasions by members of parliament for this very thing. And that is, interestingly enough, a criminal offence.
Yeah.
And so...
Was she ever prosecuted?
No, but again, the fact that there was record in the parliamentary record of MPs basically taking her to task, that is an indication that that is not a fit and proper person for the role and the responsibility that it has. And then the last thing was that, again, the CRL chair and any chair of a Chapter 9 institution, because they are, if you like, the sort of guardians, they're the watchdogs, the ombudsmans of very core rights. I mean, the public protector is another such person, for example. The Human Rights Commission is another such entity. But if you're the chairperson of that, you really have to be above reproach. You have to be unbiased. You have to be open-minded. You're like Switzerland. You know, you're supposed to be pretty neutral.
You should be following the law yourself.
Well, of course. But when it comes to religious freedom, and this particular issue, of course, her big push was for state regulation of religion, branding and labeling all pastors as potentially, bad people. One of her poster sort of child cases was, of course, the Timothy Omatosa case. But let's be clear on that. It wasn't that there was no laws that were applicable. There were. He was charged with 32 different criminal counts.
Yeah.
The reason why he was ultimately acquitted was because the National Prosecuting Authority did such a terribly bad job that the judge who was oversighting that case said, look, you just simply failed to provide the level of evidential proof that he did what he did. You could have done, you probably should have done, but you didn't, and therefore I have no option but to acquit.
Wow.
So again, law wasn't the issue there. One of the star witnesses of that was a young woman called Cheryl Zondi. And Cheryl Zondi, obviously in her evidence, was claiming that she had been abused, and I think sexually abused or groomed or that type of thing, by Timothy Omatosa. So that's obviously a terrible thing.
Which is terrible. No, it should not be happening.
And she then established a foundation, the Cheryl Zondi Foundation, to basically look for people who've been victims of spiritual abuse and either expose the people who were doing it or whatever it was that she was going to do. And the CRL chair was then appointed and accepted the position of the vice president of that organization, the Cheryl Zondi Foundation. That's an activist organization. They're activists.
Yeah.
So how can you be an unbiased chair?
Ombudsman, yeah. And beyond that.
And a leading activist for a particular cause that you're pursuing, as we have been claiming, illegitimately, because that wasn't what the CRL should be doing in the first place. And so we said there was a conflict of interests.
Which is true.
I think at least it's a very reasonable, objective opinion to share. Those were the reasons why she was so upset. And
how could you dare? How dare you tell the truth?
Again, one of the problems is that the net effect is to use South Africa's criminal justice system against me, someone, simply because I'm opposing the agenda that she's now trying to pursue. And that, I would argue, is a serious abuse of position and power. So that case is still ongoing. I mean, I've yet to have a resolution to that. But as I said, we produced chapter and verse, like cast iron evidence that we backed our position with parliamentary record. Yeah. And I'm waiting to see what the National Prosecuting Authority will do.
Maybe they'll botch your case as well. Well, that's the irony. Is that someone who's really guilty, they failed to prosecute properly, and now there's someone backing the same prosecuting authority to come after you. And it's so frustrating because, instead of making sure that there's the 3 different branches of government. There's the legislative, judiciary, and executive. So the executive is part of implementing the legislation, right? So the police does the arrest, the prosecuting authority does the prosecution. That's part of the executive. So that's actually where the problem is, because the laws are there to protect people. The laws are there to come against people who are bad actors, as you say, even in the faith community, and they should be punished. But if the punishment doesn't happen, the problem isn't that churches should be regulated.
Precisely.
The problem is you should be looking at the executive.
Exactly.
For implementing the law.
And that is the state. So that is the role of the
Wow.
state. The role of the state is to obviously make sure that laws are passed if they're missing. In other words, if there's gaps, they can pass laws, and then to enforce them efficiently and effectively. And we have no problem with that. In fact, one of the solutions that we think to this whole issue is where there is criminality taking place in faith communities, then the state must absolutely do its job and deal with that. I think particularly my personal viewpoint is that if you are in that trust position as a religious leader and you abuse that position and you resort to criminality, whatever that might look like, then it's not that there's a different crime. That doesn't make it a spiritual crime. But I think what you can do, and sometimes it does happen in the sentencing aspect of a trial, assuming that you're found guilty after due process, is maybe you should get like the full weight of the law should fall upon you, because in a sense you are in that position of trust, and maybe you've abused that trust clearly to do what you did. So again, the issue isn't that we need more laws. It's a band-aid. And the other thing that as I often say to people is, like, let's supposing you are licensed after all this, and you are monitored, and you are now, let's say, conditional on you being a good person. Does a license stop you from breaking the law? And the answer is no. I mean, you have a driver's license, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but have you ever done 61 in a 60 zone?
I may have.
Have you ever crossed that double line in the middle of the road? Have you gone up a one-way? I mean, unfortunately, everybody at some point, one of those things will put their hand up. We've all probably done it, and maybe we've all got a good reason why we did, or we parked in a no parking space or whatever it is. And yes, look, if you do that, you get punished, you get fined or what have you. But the fact is, a license doesn't stop you doing things that you shouldn't be doing. And so therefore, this whole issue and construct of having a license to decide whether or not you can and cannot preach or teach or open a church or what have you is ludicrous, because it doesn't actually solve the problem anyway.
And, we're right back at this question of how will it be implemented actually? Last when we spoke about this, you mentioned the exuberant cost it'll take just to set this up in order to run the administration of just getting all the churches on board. And then you have to regulate that actually. And if there are missteps, then someone has to follow up. And if our state can't even properly prosecute criminality, how will they do that? So it seems to me like a waste of time, and the resources, the energy that's going into this could be going into so much more constructive things for our nation. That's just what I'm thinking. But it's sad that we've reached this point.
Well, interestingly enough, one of the proposed alternative solutions that we are putting forward is the CRL has an act of parliament that gives it certain powers and prerogatives and even mandates of things that it can and should do. And one of those is that it is, and we're talking about today, it's law, they can do it tomorrow if they wanted to, or today, they can have a register of religious organizations and what they call religious experts, but you might call those religious practitioners. They can keep a register. Now, there's a huge difference between a register where you might be asked to give your name and your ID number and the name of your church and its NPO number or whatever it is, and a phone number and an email address and what have you. I don't think anybody has a problem with that.
They have you on record,
They have you on record, and it's good for communication. Their mandate is to educate and inform, and so it's good that they have that type of a record and that they can consult with the faith communities easily and effectively if they want to. That power exists. They have it in their laws. So why are they not implementing that? Because I think if they did, interestingly enough, you would actually red flag some issues. And one of the other powers that the CRL have in their existing legislation and their existing mandate is they can engage any organ of state, could be SARS, could be Department of Home Affairs, could be whatever, and make recommendations of actions that they should take if they uncover an abuse or an incident or a situation. And they have very powerful investigative powers. I mean, they can issue subpoenas and
that's
that sort
a lot.
of thing. They've got a lot of powers.
Yeah.
I mean, don't think that they're a sort of a toothless tiger.
Yeah.
They've got a lot of powers. So when it comes to that type of thing, let's supposing this registration is implemented. One of the legitimate questions that they would ask you is, your name and your ID number. And let's supposing that you're a foreign national and you have a passport. And you put your passport number in, and another good question would then be, do you have a work permit?
Yeah. Are you legal?
And of course, if you are here illegally and you are working illegally, then you are acting unlawfully, and then the law must deal with you. Fair enough. You can't say, I'm allowed to break the law because God called me here or God told me to do it. I mean, that was the prophet of doom's argument. Remember him?
Word, yeah.
He sprayed
literally
insecticide
doom
in the face of his congregants and said, God told me it would heal them. I'm so sorry, sir. That's an assault. He was charged with assault. He was found guilty. He was convicted.
Yeah.
So you can't say God told me as a defense. It never has been a defense and it never will be.
Yeah.
But in that type of instance that I've mentioned to you, of course, that will red flag perhaps some things.
Yes.
What about a bank account?
Yeah.
I think it's legitimate to say, if you have a church organization, do you have a bank account? And if the answer is no, then the next good question is, well, what do you do with the money? And if the answer is, well, we throw it up into the air and whatever God wants, he keeps, and the rest we just pocket, that's not good enough. And maybe the next call is to SARS,
Yeah.
So
and they can probably do sanctions. They can, make their life a little difficult if they need to.
Well,
yeah.
Again, if you're acting lawlessly, apply existing laws.
Yeah.
And we are saying that the CRL actually have these powers in place. Now, they should never and must never obviously say you can only register if you pass these qualifications.
Okay.
Registration is an open thing. It's not a conditional thing. And that we think is clear, because otherwise it's basically state regulations through the back door. But they have the powers today. And so what we are saying and what we're going to be really focusing on now is, yes, there are issues in the faith communities, unfortunately, and things are happening. But how do we resolve those? One of the ways, of course, and we've mentioned a couple of them now, is the application of laws and the more efficient application of laws. It's obviously this registration process that they're allowed to keep, which we think would be a good thing. The code of conduct is a very good thing. Why aren't they educating pastors, churches, religious organizations, and promoting this code of conduct so that people really do have a good baseline benchmark understanding of their responsibilities? And another good one, I think, is that we need to, really endorse and support voluntary organizations, fraternals, so-called umbrella organizations.
Yeah.
Again, the CRL chair said things have got much worse since her last term. But we now have an organisation, SACOF, Pastor Bert Pretorius. Now, one of the things which was true was that there were a lot of independent churches that weren't necessarily in any form of relationship or any structured measure, organisation, umbrella organisation. And yet what SACOF has done highly successfully since 2021 is it's brought together some 220 plus networks and organizations of churches. They now represent, the last figures I heard was some 24,000 churches under that umbrella. And there's obviously relationship, there's accountability, there's the opportunity to train, to equip, to help one another, to keep that mutual accountability basis going. These are all big improvements.
Yes.
So again, and voluntary, not legislative, voluntary. And that's, I think, the way that this thing must go. We should be encouraging that. We should be helping people to understand their responsibilities. We should be making sure that people understand that lawfulness is not an option. It's a prerequisite. And if you break the law must deal with you. And even, I think, where you find that there's lawlessness happening, why aren't pastors? Maybe they are. But if they're not, perhaps they should. If you know what's going on in your community, and local pastors typically do because they've got ears on the ground, and you know that unlawful things are happening, I think you have a responsibility to do something about it.
Yes.
And if not, why not? I don't think you can justify the why not.
Yeah.
And so, yes, let us make sure that there is accountability, particularly where the line has been crossed into criminality.
Yeah.
But again, these are solutions, that I believe would largely fix the problems that require no additional legislation, and certainly not legislation to impose some licensing system of state regulation of religion. It's simply unnecessary, it's unconstitutional, and it's unworkable.
Well, I'm so glad that you and your team are there fighting in the forefront of this, and because I'm sure you get a lot of flack and resistance. So we're praying for you and supporting you, and I'm so grateful that you guys are there. I see that Pastor Richard Crompton is fighting right beside you.
So Rich is wonderful. I mean, he obviously is an advocate.
Yeah.
I think really where we now need to switch the focus, the Section 22 committee, which is now under new leadership. The original chairperson left quite spectacularly.
Yeah, really, he shared some powerful thoughts.
I think he exposed the hidden agenda behind it. The CRL chair particularly trying to claim that this is arm's length when actually she was driving the whole process from start to finish. But I think now the Section 22 committee has put out its consultative document, the so-called draft self-regulation document, which proposes legislation. So it's predetermined, the outcome. But they're going to be running, as they have said, national consultations.
Okay.
And I think that our best strategy, that we believe, is to engage with this Section 22 committee, because it will produce a report. And I think to simply say, well, we're going to boycott it or we're not going to participate, is potentially short-sighted.
Okay.
Because even though, yes, maybe its aims and intentions are illegitimate, even unlawful, even though there are 2 court cases against it, we don't know what the outcomes of those are going to be. Even though we might look at who are the members and we might say, well, there's like almost nobody there who represents evangelical Christianity. That isn't a reason to not engage, because if you don't engage, you basically leave the door open for other people to come in to basically capture that narrative and potentially to come up with a really bad outcome and a result. And if you then object to it,
it's too late.
It's going to be, well, you had the opportunity and you didn't take it, so don't start crying now.
Wow.
So I think the better strategy that we're certainly going to be proposing is absolutely engage. Don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the Section 22 committee itself, because for all those reasons, it is, we believe, unlawful, and potentially everything it does is unlawful. And certainly don't engage on the groundwork that it has laid out. In other words, what sort of legislation would you like? The answer is none. But I think to then propose alternative, viable solutions that actually address the problems, and to present those. Because if that is the, let's say, the vast majority of the input is along those lines, then that committee has no option but to report that back to the CRL.
But if they are not legitimate and they're already sort of pushing an agenda, do you think they will actually do that if someone presents them with that?
Well, they have to, because, again, it's a matter of public record. And it's a public participation process. And if they don't, then obviously they have abused the process, and that in itself is an actionable issue.
Now, I'm just asking because some people might be listening to this and go, well, they're already doing what they want, so what would it help if I show up? So, but your motivation is, no, it will make a difference.
It will absolutely make a difference, because, of course, that's all going to be monitored.
Yeah.
And so if the vast majority of the submissions are for alternative solutions and a rejection of what they're putting forward, they have no option but to report that.
Okay.
And if they don't report that, then of course they themselves are now abusing the process. And that's something that will obviously be challenged. And it will go forward, clearly. It'll go back, first of all, to the CRL, and then that ultimately will, no likelihood, end up before the Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs COGTA Portfolio Committee, where any discrepancies will certainly be brought to the light. I think the good thing is that we've now had a formal meeting with COGTA, and that took place on the 11th of February. And COGTA is now well aware of the issues, well aware of the concerns, and they're now taking a much more sort of monitoring, oversight view of what's happening. They are even potentially looking at the CRL chair and some of the things that she has said and done, and are considering whether or not there's any further action that should be taken. So the balance has shifted, I think. And I do think public engagement, public participation, we always say, is a good thing. That is your democratic right. It's the democratic process. Don't miss the opportunity to have your say and make your voice heard.
Who is the new chair of Section 22? Is there someone appointed yet?
I understand that the new chair is Reverend Dr. John Maloma.
Okay.
He is also part of the leadership of TISA, the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa,
okay.
Which, again, TISA has had some, I think, pretty serious internal challenges from its own members because it has taken a very pro stance supporting the state regulation of religion agenda, whereas the vast majority of its members are saying absolutely not, and you never consulted us, and why are you putting our names forward? And many of them are resigning, or at the very least distancing themselves from TISA. So TISA has, I think, really overstepped its mark and its mandate.
Yeah.
But John Maloma is obviously one of the people in the TISA executive who is now been appointed as the, if not the chair, he's certainly, I think, the acting chair.
I think I saw some WhatsApp forwards about that whole thing of TISA, and I've also been made aware of some unhappiness around Pastor Josh McCauley being involved and seeming to be, on the wrong side. So there's what I find sad is that it seems to be causing division in the body of Christ, which that should not be happening.
Yeah.
And I think, so what would you say are the questions a pastor, a leader, and a congregant of a church should be asking themselves about how should I approach this matter? Because we don't want to see more division, but we do want to be on the right side of this thing. So how do we navigate this in truth and love without throwing stones at each other? That's a hard one, but I'd like to get your wisdom.
I think we have to decide what perspective we are viewing the whole matter, through what lens. I do understand that there are people who look at this with a very compassionate lens, and they see victims, and they see people who have been abused, and they have had bad things happen to them in religious contexts, in sacred spaces, as the CRL puts it.
I hear you.
And yes, we obviously should be sympathetic and empathetic to victims.
And those things should never have happened.
And they should never have happened.
We agree with that.
And the redress certainly should be to sanction the perpetrators through existing laws.
Amen.
No question about that.
Yes.
And to support the victims, obviously. Yes. But the challenge is that this is not an issue of empathy or sympathy. It's a legal constitutional issue.
Yes.
Because if through your empathy and your compassion, your solution is let's effectively eliminate a meaningful right to religious freedom, the consequences of that are potentially catastrophic, and they don't even resolve the problems or the situations or the issues that you are concerned about.
Exactly.
They simply are effectively, they fundamentally alter the balance between the role of the faith communities and the role of the state. And so I think we have to make sure that we understand that this is a constitutional and a legal matter. It is not an ecclesiastical matter. It is not a theological matter. It is not even a matter of how much compassion or empathy you have for the victims. All those things are, I think, reasonable. They're considerations, but they are not, in this instance, where the decisive issues lie.
Yeah.
The issue here is it's constitutional and it's legal, and it is unconstitutional to remove for no good reason, legitimately, especially when other solutions are available, the right to religious freedom.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, because ultimately that's what will happen, is that right will be removed or at least limited to quite a severe extent. And I mean, I don't know if you're aware of what recently happened in the Bethel community with a exposing video by a guy called Mike Winger, where he went deep into exposing some leaders and things that have come up and abuse that's happened. And I think there's a general awareness of, unfortunately, the bad things that can and have happened in the church community, and that in no way, shape or form do we say that's okay. Not at all. But the way to handle that is not to regulate religion, as you say. It is to find better ways to do that. And I think I just want to reiterate what you kind of hinted at, is when we are aware of abuse within our churches, we need to speak up, stand up, and help. And we cannot have a cover-up culture. We cannot allow things to get swept under the rug, and we cannot allow, for a lack of a better term, the man of God syndrome to bring us to a place where he can do no wrong. You know, we are accountable to God and the ruling authorities that He has placed over us, and so there's a lot there to work with already. So I'm just saying this because anyone listening to this that might be a victim or sympathize with the victims, we do as well.
Absolutely.
And it's about finding the right solution, not go to an extreme that causes more harm in the long run.
Absolutely.
Would you agree?
And no, 100%.
Yeah.
As I said, we have said from the beginning that a system of state regulation of religion, whereby every pastor, not just pastors, they want to license all religious practitioners. I even asked the CRL chair once, I said, who are these people? And we went down the list, associate pastors, yes, youth pastors, yes, worship leaders, yes. I mean, everybody gets caught in this net. You then have to be evaluated and registered and monitored, and probably also have to pay a license fee as well.
Because we have to fund this thing that they want to run.
Yeah.
Where will the money come from?
Obviously, and the money comes out of your
It's basically
tithes.
more taxes.
It's going to be out of your tithes and offerings. That's where the money's going to come from. I mean, I don't think the government has sort of millions sloshing around in its coffers that it wants to allocate to some project. It's going to look for a license fee. You have a television license, right? You do the right thing, as they say. And yes, that's where the money's, I think, almost certainly going to come from. I asked the CRL chair, where is the money going to come from? Because, we estimate that the running cost of this could be in like hundreds of millions a year just to manage and monitor it, never mind set it up in the first place. And she said, well, Parliament will decide. It's like, yeah, but, license fee is the obvious choice. That's what happens in Rwanda, by the way.
Wow.
In Rwanda, you pay, I think it's a 25,000 Rand a year license fee. And of course, again, one of the possible motivations for this is financial, because at the moment the CRL's budget is 50 million a year, plus minus. If you can register 100,000 religious organizations and you charge them 25,000 a year, like they do in Rwanda, and maybe each one of them has 5 religious practitioners who perhaps have to pay a 5,000 a year license, well, your income has gone from 50 million to 5 billion a year.
My goodness.
That's 5,000 million. And that, of course, comes...
That's a big motivator.
Well, that's a motivator. And, of course, money is power.
Yeah.
And then who's going to be in these peer review committees that are going to ultimately decide who's going to manage it, who's going to monitor it, who's going to run it, who's going to evaluate it.
It comes back to the big old question, who's policing the police?
Well, again,
sure.
The accountability of that type of system can become quickly very suspect.
Yeah.
So we're saying leave the faith communities to self-regulate in the truest sense of the word. Make sure that they stay and really make sure that they stay within the parameters of the rule of law, and do what you can to educate people. Because, again, pastors don't wake up in the morning saying, how can I break the law? But there may be issues, particularly compliance issues, where they might not be as, let's say, on point as they should be. Yeah. Probably because they don't know what they should be doing. So educate them, inform them, bring unity. It's not difficult. The solutions are there.
Yeah.
But state regulation of religion through legislation is an absolute no-no.
Maybe a last question. This I know you don't like not talking about facts, and I don't want you to feel pressured, but I believe that if this goes to its full extent and to where they want it to go, it could lead to a national form of persecution against the church, and it could force a segment of the church, at least, for a lack of a better term, underground, to avoid these regulations and licenses and stuff. Because what happened to the 9,000 churches in Rwanda that were shut down? If those people, if half of those leaders are truly believers who love Jesus and want to see people healed, what are they going to do? They're going to run underground. They're going to keep getting people saved. And we've seen this in China. We've seen it's happening in the UK in a way that these things are. It's shifting culture. It's forcing the church underground. And on Sunday recently, I spoke to my church about it, and I said, listen, we actually have it quite easy still. We're in a comfortable space. As a church in South Africa, we can gather in public spaces, and we have those freedoms, and praise God for that. And I've reminded them a few times, we have people like you to thank for the fact that has still remained that way. But this is under pressure. This is under attack. What if it's not there anymore? And I made the statement. I said, there's a part of me that thinks maybe we should be persecuted. Maybe we should feel the pressure because maybe we'll be more effective. But then there's another part of me that goes, I don't want that because, someone has already fought for that. So we should protect it. So do you think this is a form of persecution? Do you think if it goes through, it can force a segment of the church underground? I'm putting you on the spot, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
No, look, I think it is obviously a matter, and it's in the public domain. Last year, I think it was July, the National Security Report was released. And in that National Security Report, listed amongst serious internal threats to South Africa's,
national
security, it lists mushrooming charismatic churches.
What?
And that refers...
What does that mean?
Well, interestingly enough, that the definition of a charismatic church in this report is 100% accurate. I would say, well, that's exactly what charismatic churches are. Good job.
But they're saying there's a national threat.
But they see this as a priority national security threat.
Why?
And it's there alongside extreme terrorism, alongside organized crime, alongside, unchecked immigration.
My goodness.
In other words, it's completely insane that it is there, but it refers to the CRL chair's previous report in 2017.
But how does, even if all those things are true, how would that get to the level of national security being threatened?
That is a great mystery.
It's basically calling it domestic terrorism.
Effectively, it's listed alongside domestic terrorism.
That's hectic.
And of course, that is very dangerous.
Whoa.
So I think, number one, that has to be redressed. Yeah. It has to be checked. It has to be challenged, I think.
Absolutely.
We've asked the CRL to challenge it. They don't seem to be putting their hand up to do that.
Well, it wouldn't suit their narrative.
But be that as it may, it still has to be checked and it still has to be addressed.
Wow.
Will it drive underground if you start to persecute like that? The answer is yes. The one thing, and our laws have been clear on this, and our constitutional court judgments have been clear on this, that you should never put people in a position whereby they have to choose, do I obey the state, and potentially, if I don't suffer, immediate physical consequences, could be fines, could be jail or whatever, or do I obey God, and if I don't, potentially face eternal consequences? Because when you put somebody in that type of conundrum, generally speaking, if they're sincere, they will go with their faith.
Of course.
And at that point, you have a serious breakdown.
Yeah.
Persecution, I do not think is at all a good thing.
No.
Look, does it happen? Yes. Can God work it together for good? Yes. But generally speaking, it's not a good thing. If you want an instance, and we literally have an example right up the road from here, Franschhoek. Franschhoek means French corner. That is where the Huguenots were French Protestants who, during the time of Martin Luther and the Reformation, believed in a way that was different. They were heretics. Heretics means to choose. They chose not to believe what the Catholic Church's doctrine of the day was. And at one point, there were nearly 2 million of them in France, particularly in the southern parts of France. They suffered the most horrific persecution. There was one, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where history records that potentially 100,000 were killed in one single night.
My goodness.
And the bells rang with celebrations at that.
But that was technically Christians killing Christians, which is very scary.
By the time they were finished, there were less than 20,000 left.
Yeah.
Now, France has never had a powerful, let's say, Protestant evangelical Christian witness ever to this day. Why?
Wow.
Because it effectively crushed it out during that time. So persecution in and of itself is I think, not a good thing. And yes, the remainder came to South Africa, or some of them did, and they set up Franschhoek, and the Huguenots obviously settled there, and many people in South Africa have names like de Villiers and Le Cranchy, and which is obviously is a mispronunciation of their French original pronunciation of their names. But we have a lot of those maybe people to thank who came and actually gave a legacy of Protestant evangelical faith to this country.
Sure. That's a overwhelming thought, and that we are here as a nation, where we're supposed to be this bastion of freedom, this democracy, that we are even talking about these things. But I mean, if you look at the pattern around the world, there seems to be an attack on the Christian faith, especially the charismatic evangelical side of it. I was fascinated in being in Pakistan last year on a mission trip. And I'm just going to share my observation. We were driving around with a pastor that I'm with, and he's been telling me stories about how them and other charismatic churches in Pakistan are very much persecuted. It's a 98% Muslim nation, and they are socially persecuted, physically persecuted. Just a year before, 26 houses and churches were burned down belonging to Christians. So it's like real. People are murdered if they get promotion at work and they're a Christian, stuff like that, like real stories. And we were driving around, and I noticed that there's quite a few Roman Catholic churches and buildings and schools around. And he said, they are protected by the state. And the Muslim children go to those schools because they're good schools. It's good education. But if you're a charismatic Christian, you are persecuted to the extent that you can't go there, which is really fascinating to me. So just putting it out there. But it's very interesting to notice that the persecution seems to be aimed at those who believe the Bible, stand on the Bible, walk in the fullness of the Holy Spirit and what that means, and that there's really an attack on that. And I guess in a way we should be expecting it. Jesus said, blessed are those who are persecuted and reviled for my name's sake. But these are very real things. And I think we, as a church in general, we need to be aware, and we need to go, Lord, how do we approach this? And pray, stand, and be part of the solution, right?
I think importantly, stand up for your rights. Those rights were hard won.
Yes, good point.
That we didn't just wake up one day and thought, let's give everybody a right to religious freedom. It was really the consequence of horrific persecution.
People died for that.
In some countries in the religious wars in Europe, 60% of the entire population of entire countries died.
My goodness.
So, we're talking about a level of bloodshed that has actually been the purchasing power, so to speak, of these very rights. And these rights are recent. Really, the first significant recognition of the right to religious freedom was only in 1948, Section 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not a...
Wow.
That's relatively modern.
Yes.
And here's the thing. If you have a right and you don't defend it and you don't stand on it, you can very quickly lose it. And to me, probably one of the most chilling examples is my own country. I come from the UK, as you probably know. And I studied law at the University of Bristol. That's where I got my kind of legal background training, such as it is.
Are you a solicitor, barrister? What is the term?
I never qualified.
Okay.
In the midst of it, I had a clear call to come to South Africa, so I never completed that. But but when I was at university, I said to my professors, I said, what is there that protects and upholds these rights, our Christian culture, our religious freedoms, our democratic rights? And the answer was, well, my boy, this is England, and we have the Magna Carta, and some of the great saints have come out of England. We have the cradle of Christianity, John Wesley and William Wilberforce, and the list goes on. Well, lo and behold, not even 35 years later, a pastor in Bristol, not even a kilometre from where that assurance was given to me, is reading his Bible out loud in public. And he says, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. He's arrested. Why? Because he was causing a breach of the peace, potentially. People were very unhappy that he was reading scriptures in public. And the Crown, the state prosecutor in that trial, said that in 21st century Britain, if you read certain scriptures out loud in public, it will almost certainly amount to hate speech.
My goodness.
And the problem with hate speech is hate speech has become speech that I hate.
Yeah.
And that's not the true definition at all of hate speech. And he was fined 30,000 rand. It was overturned on appeal. But the way that the UK has completely reversed itself as the champion of democracy and the foundational democratic rights, free speech being one in particular, is chilling and extraordinary and I think deeply concerning. They now have, for example, in the vicinity of abortion clinics, I think it's some sort of 2-kilometre radius, no prayer zones. You're not allowed to pray. And on several occasions now, people have been arrested. The one woman, she was called Isabel Vaughan Spruce, was standing on the street, just standing. And a policeman walks up to her. What are you doing? She says, I'm just here. And he asks her, are you praying? And she says, well, I may be silently in my head. She's arrested. Why? That's a thought crime.
A thought crime.
So
I read that in a book somewhere.
Think about how quickly you can lose your rights if you don't stand for them.
Exactly.
And I think as Christians, we need to also be aware. Christians I find sometimes are a little bit perhaps hesitant. It's like, we're in the world but not of it. But the answer is you're in the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And while you're here, you need to make a difference.
You have, I believe, a duty as a citizen of this country.
Yeah.
And how can you even, and this is maybe me putting on a more pastoral hat, how can you do what Christ has commanded us to do, the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations, if you're not involved in the life of the nation?
Yeah.
And the Apostle Paul, he, interestingly enough, was a Roman citizen.
Yes.
And that was an unusual thing, and that gave him very powerful rights in that society.
It extended his mission.
He exercised those rights.
Yes.
He literally said, you cannot beat me. I'm a Roman citizen. Where he had been beaten, he demanded that the magistrate, as a show of penance and, almost apology, escorted him personally out of town. When he was potentially going to be assassinated, he was given a cavalry escort to get him safely from A to B. And where he wasn't getting justice, he used his right to appeal to Caesar, to go to Rome. So don't think that it's somehow spiritual to just not stand up for our rights and say, well, I'm blessed because I'm being persecuted. You've been given those rights for a purpose. And it's part of, I think, your duty being in the world.
So good.
Even if you might be not of it, to actually stand up for your rights so that you can effectively exercise the advantage that you have in this society to freely express your faith and to live it out in private and in public without fear of sanction from the state or anyone else.
I think that's one of the reasons that happens. I think the other reason is just, quite honestly, apathy and like head in the sand. Like I'd rather not know about these things. I just want to be able to go to my church and do my cultural thing, and I don't want to get involved because I believe in the separation of state and church and whatever. And I think that's not a thing we can do anymore. I don't think it ever was a thing, but we cannot allow that to happen. We need people to stand up, and you might think, what difference will I make? Well, if every person who has the conviction stands where they are, that will have a ripple effect. That will have national impact. So never neglect, even if you have a small sphere of influence, stand in that small sphere of influence, even if it's just your family or your church or your community. I think that's so important, what you're saying. And that we are aware that these things are under attack. We have a role to play. We can pray for wisdom and how to address that.
No, you're 100% correct. And I do think as well that, yes, there is a separation of church or faith communities and the state because they fulfill different functions. But one thing I think as a Christian you cannot do is you cannot separate God from government.
Amen.
Because all authority ultimately, as Christians believe, comes from him. And therefore we have a responsibility as citizens to operate and function in the society that he's given us. Yes, to be law-abiding, but also to make sure that we don't, as you say, bury our head in the sand. Ignorance is not bliss. No. Ignorance is perhaps one step away from foolishness, because if you don't become aware of what's happening, then you won't know what to do about it. And again, a biblical example, the sons of Issachar were those who understood the times, and they were commended for that. So be informed, be aware, be alert, and be ready, whatever you can do, whatever measure that may be, to take a stand where a stand is needed.
The righteous rejoice. The people rejoice when the righteous are in government, and I like that scripture. But I recently heard this pastor share something that I thought was quite profound. He said, yes, maybe there's a separation between state and church, but that's, like you say now, there's specific roles. The state has roles to play. It needs to pave the roads, make sure that we've got running water and all that stuff, and that's great. That's their function. We don't want to get involved in that. But once the government starts telling people stuff that should be under the church, like, well, actually, no, marriage, we're going to tell you what that is. And we're going to tell you what a male and a female is. And we're going to tell you what should happen to a fetus. And we're going to tell you, then it's crossing a line. And we should start going, actually, not on our watch. And I thought that was quite thought-provoking, is it political to stand up for spiritual things, or is the political arena actually trampling into the spiritual arena, and now there's a clash? Because a lot of people don't speak up and don't say something because they're like, well, I don't want to be political. Well, how can you not speak about biblical things just because it might have some connection to what they're talking about in the political arena? It's still true. Marriage is still what God says it is, and life is still what God ordains. So we need to stay relevant, and I think these are things that we should talk about.
Yeah, look, importantly, and why is freedom of expression, freedom of speech so important? Freedom of religion, which is obviously also freedom of expression and speech. Why is it so important in our democracy? And simply this, that you have to have different viewpoints that can be ventilated and aired, even if they are opposing viewpoints. Because so many of the advances, the progress that societies, civilizations have made, have come as a consequence of the fact that there has been robust debate. And that robust debate might have started off with one side completely dominant until that dominance is challenged, and then another solution is made. I mean, slavery is a classic example. We mentioned William Wilberforce.
What a story.
Slavery was generally accepted as normal. This is how society just is. And yet William Wilberforce came along and said, no, because we're all made in the image of God, and therefore we cannot have one person being owned by another. It took him a lifetime, literally, before a law was passed that basically abolished slavery, first of all in the UK and its Commonwealth. And then the British then literally spent thousands, millions, effectively, they put their whole navy and their whole, force in around the world into play to stop the slave trade wherever they found it. So, yes, a complete redress and a complete reversal, thanks to the fact that somebody, and obviously persuading many others, changed the laws, changed the culture, changed the context. And that is why I think it's so important that, voices of the faith community are heard in these matters as well, because they are as important a voice as any other voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since you touched on it, and I think it's also a relevant thing that ties into this, you're also involved in a process of making sure that hate speech bill that's already been signed into law, right?
Yes.
So unfortunately, that's already happened. But now you guys are trying to make sure that it's amended, if I understand correctly. Please fill us in on what's the latest there. What should we be aware of, and how can we again, be part of the solution towards a better situation there?
Well, I think maybe we just should step back and refresh on the context of this.
Yes.
The Constitution of South Africa protects all speech, but there's certain very limited speech that it does not protect, and that it defines as hate speech.
Yes.
And hate speech is defined as an advocacy to hatred combined with an incitement to do harm. So those two elements run together. And
that's in the Constitution.
That's in the Constitution.
Yes, okay.
So the Constitution of South Africa is the lens. It's the highest law. It is the lens through which all other laws are examined and effectively evaluated and judged. And that's why the Constitutional Court is the highest court of the land in South Africa. And where there's questions around the Constitution, where there's questions around how the law applies, that's when the Constitutional Court ultimately will rule. They will interpret, if you like, the Constitution in certain ways. So the Constitution says hate speech is an advocacy to hatred with an incitement to do harm. What's an example of that? Let's supposing, and I'm saying something here which I find absolutely reprehensible, but let's supposing an example of hate speech could be gas the Jews. Okay, who do we want you to hate? Jewish people. What do we want you to do to them? Put them in the gas chamber, i.e. kill them. That's classic hate speech. Hate the Jews, harm them by killing them. Now, that is obviously reprehensible, and that should never be protected, and it has never been protected. But the challenge comes when you start to broaden the definition of what hate speech is. And one of the biggest challenges, and we fought this for many years, was this Prevention of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Act. Not so much the hate crimes was the issue, but the hate speech was the issue. Why? Because, as we often say, the devil's in the definitions.
In the detail, yeah.
Well, particularly the definitions,
Yes.
because all laws have definitions, and judges simply interpret what the law says. That's what judges do. And so if the law says something that is, vague and subjective, that's a real problem, particularly if the outcome, which is the case in this law, is for a first offence 5 years in jail.
Goodness.
And so what are the definitions? Well, I was on a radio debate with the former Deputy Minister of Justice, John Jeffrey, who was the main force that was driving this particular piece of legislation. This is before it was signed.
Okay.
And I said to him, so, you have this law and it says the prevention of hate crimes and hate speech, but there's no definition of hate or hatred or hateful. You don't define it. How do you know when you've crossed the line? I mean, bearing in mind, it's criminal. The consequences are criminal.
Yeah, it's quite
5 years
serious.
in jail.
Yeah.
You need to know, one of the principles of criminal law is you must know when you are committing a crime. It must be clear to you.
Which is the point of a law.
That you know that you're stepping over the line, or at least you should have known.
Yeah.
And so his answer to me was, look it up in the dictionary.
Oh, goodness.
I said to him, but, I hate cabbage. When is hatred enough to cross the line? In other words, it's ridiculous to say, look it up in the dictionary, because how you interpret hate and how I interpret hate might be two totally different things. And what we might hate also might be two totally different things.
But there's also a whole legal system and a bunch of laws and contracts that go directly against that statement. Like, you have to define words. The first thing you read in a legislation or in a contract is definitions.
And
Why?
And they're not there.
Because it's not open to so it's not open to weird interpretation.
Yeah. So another thing which was very vague and loose and very dangerous, therefore, is hate speech is now, if I express something, say something, even perhaps draw something that causes you substantial emotional harm. What is substantial emotional harm exactly? And again, significantly, the criteria or the categories of people who are protected from hate speech, which in the Constitution is limited to 4, have now been expanded to about 20. And maybe possibly more. And among that, you have, for example, gender and gender expression.
Oh, my.
Now, those are very, again, undefined and very controversial social ideological constructs. So how do you then define substantial emotional harm when what might cause you substantial emotional harm, i.e. deeply offends you, might not touch me at all? Because actually it's subjective. And how can you have a criminal law that is so subjective? And the other big challenge, of course, about this was that we asked for specifically, and when I say we, there was a massive public participation process, and I know that you were involved in it and many others were. And literally in total, some probably close to 200,000 submissions were made. The vast majority of which were basically saying, define hate and hateful and hatred clearly, so we know what we're talking about here. And obviously, get rid of the subjectivity of substantial emotional harm, which is basically anything that I find hateful, anything that offends me. Another one was social harm. That was, if it causes social harm. What is social harm? It's defined as anything that undermines the social fabric of South Africa.
What does that mean? Yeah. Oh my goodness. And I just want to interject there quickly and to just help our audience understand that one of the reasons this is problematic is this could come directly against a pastor or a leader sharing anything from the Bible that causes emotional harm or social damage to someone according to their definition. And then suddenly the Christian community could be under attack criminally for hate speech.
Yes.
For just exercising our freedom of religion, right?
Yeah, well,
so that is one of the main problems.
Yeah, well, and we tried to ameliorate that by saying, put in a solid, robust defense for legitimate, bona fide religious expression.
Okay.
And they didn't.
Okay.
There is a clause, but it is what we call a circular clause. It basically says that if you say something on the basis of your faith and your belief and you express that, you are protected from the consequences of this particular hate speech law, of being sent to jail for 5 years, unless what you said actually falls within the definition of a hate speech according to this piece of legislation.
That doesn't help. Yeah.
That doesn't help at all. It's a circular. It's useless.
Aye.
And so one of the challenges then, as you correctly point out, is that if you on a Sunday, for example, without having any intention of hurting or upsetting anybody, said to your congregation, reading out of the Bible, in the beginning God made them male and female. God did not create a third sex, and God is not confused about the sex of the body that you find yourself in, because you are perfectly and wonderfully made. Those statements would be, I think, both theologically true, and I think they would be biologically true. The fact is they might be deeply offensive to people who believe that I am in the wrong body, or I don't believe that there are only male and female. I believe that gender is a spectrum. Now, the question is, should those people be empowered by a law to then file criminal charges against you simply for what you stated, which is theologically true and biologically true? And we would argue absolutely not. And one of the big challenges of this law, which, as I said, the president has signed it into law, but he has not, thank God, signed it into implementation.
Okay.
So one more signature and all these ill effects would immediately be applicable, potentially. So we looked at this and we thought, well, okay, thank God he hasn't signed it into implementation yet. But of course, you might be aware that the Department of Justice put out some regulations under this act for public comment, and that closed, I think, at the end of last month. That indicates that this is about to get the second signature.
Okay, sure.
So the question then is, what do you do about a law that is, we believe, clearly unconstitutional? It's unconstitutional because, of course, the definition of hate speech in the Constitution is very narrow. This is very broad. And interestingly enough, there is also hate speech in the PAPUDA, or so-called Equality Act, which is a civil act.
Yes.
And the big defining case of that was the case of John Kwelani, who made very egregious and vilifying statements about the LGBT community. And he argued, one of the points that he argued in his case in his defense was that the definition of hate speech in the Equality Act was broader than the Constitution's. And that point he won. They still said what you did was, in fact, indeed hate speech. So he didn't win his case in that sense. In fact, he was actually dead by the time the case was finally settled.
Oh, wow.
But what the Constitutional Court did was they then rewrote that particular clause to make it aligned with the Constitution. So hate speech has to have elements of vilification, of really detrimental and derogatory and derisive. It depends on the context in which you actually make those statements. It depends on, maybe the level of personal power you have when you make those statements. So there are different elements that can actually elevate it and escalate it. But the fact of the matter is that now, here's the crazy part, it is easier if this hate speech act, the criminal act, is actually signed into implementation. It will be easier for me to file charges to see you in jail for 5 years than it will be for me to file a civil action and make you make an apology or pay a fine.
Oh, wow.
That's how disparate these things are.
That's a little scary.
And the other thing which was, I think, very important to note about the Equality Act in that particular case, the Equality Act was signed into law in the year 2000, if I remember rightly. And the decision that changed the definition of hate speech in the Equality Act came about in 2021. Now, one of the things that you have to understand about laws when they're passed by Parliament and ultimately signed in by the President is that they are in force and enforceable until such a point that they are either overturned by a constitutional court judgment, as was the case with the Equality Act, or by an amendment bill or another piece of legislation that actually changes the original law.
Okay.
So those are really your two options. When you have a law that is potentially as dangerous as we see it, particularly to legitimate faith expression, but not just that, by the way, it's to other expressions.
Yeah,
too.
It's got far-reaching effects. Yeah,
and it's so far-reaching that you don't even have to be somebody who is in direct hearing of the expression that was made that is offensive. It could be something that somebody else has passed on to you that is passed on to somebody else,
like through social media.
And if I then also tweet or somehow socially distribute something you said, I'm also
liable
in the firing line.
Wow.
So it's a huge and broad and very dangerous net. So, okay, the question then is, what do you do now that this is passed into law, one more signature into implementation? And there are two options. The one is you challenge it through the court system. That means that you have to basically file and you declare that for these reasons it is unconstitutional.
Which is super expensive and takes time.
Both those things.
Yeah.
Because you have to start at the High Court, then it's the Supreme Court of Appeal, then the Constitutional Court, and the legal fees that are involved, never mind the time, which could take between 3, 5, 7 years, who knows.
My goodness.
It takes a long time and it costs a fortune of money.
Yeah.
But what we felt was a better plan was to see if we can amend this particular law to
before
fix
the final signature. Yeah.
And to fix the issues.
Yeah.
We have no issue about, for example, racist speech being defined as hate speech. That was the original intention of this act. It was to basically clamp down on racist speech. Now, even though we have laws in this country, in any event, like crim and injuria, Penny Sparrow, Vicky Momberg, they both said very egregious things, racist remarks, and they were duly convicted criminally for those things. So we have crim and injuria anyway. But let's supposing that the purpose of this law was to really tighten racist speech and to clamp down on it and to criminalize it. Well, okay, fair enough. But again, there are international safeguards to that, which were also ignored in the Act. There's the Rabat test, which was not implemented or included. And we also think that that should have been there as well, because we have international treaty obligations in South Africa to follow these parameters, which they didn't do. But let's take that off the table and say racist speech, legitimate reason to criminalize it. What we're saying is not faith expression, not religious freedom rights, which
Yeah.
are deeply infringed by this. And so what we believe is the best solution is through an amendment bill that will specifically tighten up the definitions that are loose for everybody, and they obviously need to be tightened up. We shouldn't have substantial emotional harm as the trigger point for this whole thing. We need to know what you mean by hate and hateful and hatred and harm and that type of thing.
And social harm, yeah.
And let's tighten those up, and let's make sure that there's a robust defense for legitimate faith expression, because surely government didn't mean to clamp down on that. And the good news is that a particular political party, the United Democratic Movement, the UDM, have actually taken this up, and they are now proposing that this legislation is made potentially a private member's bill and introduced into Parliament, into the legislative calendar of Parliament. And that would be a huge win.
Wow.
And we are very grateful that there are political parties, and it's not just the UDM, of course, who are pushing for these things. I mean, the ACDP has also done a tremendous work there. Other parties, too, for that matter, have taken religious freedom very seriously. And the DA, interestingly enough, has got a very positive view of religious freedom, and others. So we're not politically supportive of anybody. We are politically neutral for SA. But
grateful for someone who's helping this.
Anybody who will step up and
of course
defend religious freedom. And so the UDM are actually now trying to introduce this as a private member's bill. And in the event that they do, what I think we all need to do in faith communities is to give, when the public participation process then takes place on this now new piece of legislation, because it will be an amendment bill. Now, what's an amendment bill? It changes existing laws. Bella, we all remember Bella, right? It was the Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill.
Yeah.
So, yes, there will be a whole public participation process, and our absolute encouragement will be that when this piece of legislation is going through that particular process, let's all en masse climb in and support it, because it is the best opportunity we have to fix something which otherwise could be seriously problematic, and if not weaponized and used overtly to persecute people of faith. So we're very encouraged by that and thankful that a political party is willing to actually step up and to exercise its opportunities that it has to push something which we believe is extremely positive for the faith communities.
That's amazing. That's encouraging. I'm glad there's good news on the horizon as well, because it does seem, especially the last 2 years that we've been talking as well, that there's just bills being introduced and passed that sometimes seems purely unnecessary, or so vague that you kind of go, what is the agenda here, And when you guys challenge it, the message you get back is, we'll never do that. That'll never happen, But the thing is, the language is so vague, and the definitions are so open-ended that it can, unfortunately, if it's abused by someone, go down a very wrong road. So again, thank you for what you guys are doing. Thank you for standing up. I hope that this and other mediums help, especially I want to speak to people who are in the faith community to realize what's going on. We can't just keep on taking our rights for granted. Someone fought for it, someone died for it. We have them. Let's not lose them. Let's stand up. Let's fight. Let's support 4SA. Let's support other organizations that are doing this. And so well done, and thank you. And maybe just as a last thing, tell people, how can they support you guys and help you in this fight?
Well, we basically say 3 Ps. The one thing is prayer. We know that these issues are not natural issues. There's often a supernatural agenda behind them, we believe. So do please pray for us and pray for these situations as well. Secondly, participate. That's absolutely key, because you as a citizen have a voice. And you might think, oh, well, what does my voice count? Well, one voice is, yes, a whisper. But if 100,000 people are making the same voice, then it becomes a loud shout. And in public participation and in politics generally, it's a numbers game. And so, as I said, for this hate speech amendment bill, get involved, support the process, support what is being proposed, because if you do that, then you are indeed being a champion of freedom of speech and freedom of expression and religious freedom particularly. And then provide. We are dependent upon people who generously make financial donations to us. We have no external funding. We only get what people decide to give us. And I do believe that we are adding tremendous value to the faith communities of South Africa, to every individual. Because I know that, we've been doing this for now 12 years. Without 4SA's involvement, there would be a very different legal and, framework. And it would be, I think, extremely detrimental compared to what it now is. We've managed to hold the line largely. And that's why people don't perhaps feel the persecution. Maybe we've done too good a job.
Yeah.
But yes, and I think the other thing is stay informed.
Yes.
Because, as I said, ignorance isn't bliss.
No.
And the best way to do that is to go to our website. We have a particular place you can sign up for our newsletter. We won't spam you, but we will certainly make sure you stay informed. We have WhatsApp groups. We have, obviously, on our website, we post all the latest positions. We have a Facebook page, Freedom of Religion SA. We have a YouTube channel. We're trying to get more social media adept. But yeah, stay informed, stay engaged, and be an active citizen.
Come on. Thank you. Let's do that, and let's bring the change and fight for the freedoms we have.
Yeah, and thank you, Heinz, because I love In HeinzSight BoldCast, and you are also a voice that speaks out about these things. And so thank you for having me on your show and for giving me this platform.
Of course. Boldness is contagious, so hopefully more people are bold now to stand up, and you're an inspiration to me, and I really see you as a modern-day hero for the faith and for what you're doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Heinz.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the In HeinzSight BoldCast. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it empowered you, equipped you, and at least made you think about a few things you may not have thought about before. We want to encourage you to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with as many people as possible, and check out the other videos on this channel. There are some amazing conversations that you may not have heard yet from people that you may not be familiar with, but that have amazing things to share with you. So make sure you go and check them out. We also want to encourage you to go out and be bold, stand for the truth. Do not be ashamed of your biblical or more conservative worldview. It's time to stand up. It's time to speak up. Remember, boldness is contagious.